Hey class, today we're going to start the last section of chapter 3. So section 3, we've split this into two parts. So today we're going to cover part 1, and then when we come back to school, we're going to cover part 2. This section starts off with a picture of a large iceberg. And the reason it starts off with a large iceberg is because it contains a lot of fresh water and actually supplies millions of people with water each year. Now, as it moves into warmer areas, ice changes from a liquid water and eventually disappears. Now, we've been learning about the three different phases, and one of those phases is solid, which is what ice is. And the other one changes to liquid, so that's the second phase we've learned about. And what happens is it eventually disappears. So what happens when a substance changes from one phase to another? That's going to be our driving question for this chapter. Okay. So in order to understand phase changes and answer this key question, what are the 6 common types of phase changes, we actually have to know what a phase change is. So here it says when at least 2 states of the same substance are present, scientists describe each different state as a phase. So a phase change is defined as a reversible physical change that occurs when a substance changes from one state to another. So let's break that down. It's reversible, which means you can undo it. It's physical, which means does not change the composition. And again, it changes from one state to another. So it changes between solid, liquid, and gas. So those are the 3 states of matter we're going to talk about that it's changing between. And those 6 phase changes are melting, freezing, vaporization, condensation, sublimation, deposition. So over here, we're going to take all those 6 that we just learned about, and we're going to make a diagram that not only lists the 6 physical changes that can occur between solid, liquids, and gases, but it's also going to tell us other information as well. So right here, we've listed a solid, and we've put like an ice cube to represent it, a liquid, such as a water drop, and then a gas. Here we've put our 6 phase changes. What this diagram also illustrates is that each arrow represents the different phase changes. So, for example, the way the arrow is pointing is the way the phase change is occurring. So sublimation is pointing from solid to gas. So this is when a solid turns into a gas. Deposition is the opposite. Gas turns into a solid. Over here, melting goes to liquid. So melting is solid to a liquid, and freezing is liquid to a solid. Now, all phase changes share certain characteristics related to energy and temperature, and so that's why we've also color-coded these arrows as well. For example, sublimation's arrow is red, and that's because it takes heat or energy to turn a solid into a gas. Another good example is freezing. It's blue because it has to lose heat or energy in order to freeze and become super cold. So red means that it's gaining heat. So red equals and blue equals losing. So what happens to a substance temperature now that we know that it plays a role during a phase change? Well, one way to recognize a phase change is by actually measuring the temperature of the substance as it heats or cools. And the way we can recognize a phase change is because the temperature does not change during an actual phase change. So when in the exact moment it's changing from a solid to a liquid, it actually doesn't change temperature. So that is a key question that will appear on your test. So please highlight, mark that, whatever you're going to do, and know that I will ask that. Now, what do I exactly mean by that sentence? Well, over here, I have a graph of data, and it's collected when a solid piece of naphthalene is slowly heated. The temperature of naphthalene is going to keep rising because we're heating it. So here, after 1 minute, it has risen to almost 50 degrees or 48. At 2 minutes, it's risen to about 67 degrees, and it's going to keep rising. And then you're going to notice that this graph actually flattens out, where at 5 and 6 and 6.5 minutes, it's almost the same temperature. So right here where this graph flattens out and remains about 80 degrees, this is when melting point is taking place. So you notice that during a phase change or melting, there is no change in temperature. It's about the same. Once melting is all the way done, then the temperature keeps rising again. But during that phase change, it's no temperature change. Okay. So if the liquid naphthalene was reversed and instead of heating it up, we cool it down, we're going to notice that the opposite effect is going to take place. The temperature is going to drop until it reaches about 80, and then it's going to remain at 80 until all of the naphthalene has frozen. And at that point that it remains at 80, that's the phase change of also known as freezing point. So let's go back to that. If I were to reverse it and cool it down, you would see it get colder, colder, colder. And then right at the freezing point, it's going to straighten out. And then once everything freezes, then it's going to get colder and colder and colder again. Okay. Even if we took naphthalene and we heated it where we kept heating it where it would turn into a gas or boil, boiling point, again, is a temperature change. At the point that it's turning from a liquid to a gas, there is no temperature change. Now, energy and phase changes. This is also going to be a key thing within your test. During a phase change, what happens is energy is transferred between a substance and its surroundings. So the substance could be an ice cube, or it can be water, or it can be a gas, and its surroundings is things around it, like its environment. The direction of the transfer depends on the type of phase change. And we kind of saw this when we saw our diagram, so we'll bring that back up. The key thing here to know is that energy is either absorbed or released during a phase change. A good example of this is if you had an ice sculpture of a dog sled. Here's one that was carved for a winter fair in Fairbanks, Alaska. The ice sculpture, what happens is it's going to start to melt if it's left outside. Now, why does it do that? Well, ice will melt, so melt is your phase change, if the temperature rises above 0 degrees, because what happens is that sunlight shines directly onto it. So energy is being absorbed by the ice. So energy, again, can either be released or absorbed, but when it melts, it's being absorbed. This is known as an endothermic change. So endothermic change is a very important thing to know for your test. It's when you absorb energy, and melting is a very, very good example of this. In fact, 1 gram of ice absorbs about 334 joules of energy as it melts, and this is known as the heat of fusion for water. So how much heat or energy does it take to melt something? So the heat of fusion is how much energy / heat needed to melt 1 gram of something. I will not ask you about heat of fusion on your test, but if you ever take any upper division science classes, you're going to hear that word come around again. Okay. The opposite is true over here with our lettuce. Is that what it is? Strawberry? Oh, strawberry plants. Energy is released as ice forms or when it starts to freeze on these strawberry plants to keep them basically from freezing and dying. So what happens is energy is released in order for this to cool down. Okay. So 1 gram of water releases 334 joules of energy as it freezes, which is, again, if you look at the previous slide, this is the same amount it needs to absorb to melt. So remember, freezing and melting are opposites of each other. So if one releases 334 joules, the other one gains 334 joules. Now, I'm not going to ask you that on your test, but it is a good piece of information to kind of make connections. Now, as water freezes, it actually releases heat. And this is the opposite of when it melts, where it gains heat. Now, the flow of heat slows the drop of temperature and actually protects crops from damage. And this is known as an exothermic change, or otherwise, heat is released to the surroundings. So freezing is a good example of this. Now, before I finish, told you I was going to take you back to that diagram again. So we're going to take you back here. If you see red gaining of heat or energy, again, this is going to be, if you're gaining it, endothermic. So now that we know that word, we know that when it's a red arrow, it's an endothermic reaction. It's absorbing heat. Where blue, if you lose heat or energy, this is exothermic. I like to think of exothermic like exiting. The heat is exiting or leaving. Endo, I like to think of enter, like an enter sign. So heat or energy is entering into it. So there's a little bit of breakdown of the 6 different phase changes, which way they go, so gas to a solid, which we're going to learn about tomorrow, and then what these little red and blue arrows mean. Okay? So that's actually the end of the lesson, and if you have any questions, please make sure you contact me and ask, and I will help you. I hope you have a good day. Bye.